Okay, looks like we're started. Just quickly to go through housekeeping, guys, you are all on mute when we get to questions. If you want to come off mute and you've got a question to ask, just raise your hand and I can take it off. If you don't want to ask the question, you want me to ask the question, just pop it in the question box and I can do that. So yeah, to get us started, we've got about an hour. I was just saying to Lars before, we've got about an hour to run through. I think I first saw Lars, I was trying to work this out whether it was 4 or 5 years ago, presenting at Hiring Success in San Fran. And it was when I was working for a HR tech company, so obviously read all of Lars's content. So I was pretty excited when Redefining HR came out, and I bought it and it sat on my bookshelf, as these things do, for a good few months. And it was only after we came up with the book club suggestion, I was like, right, I've got to read it and I've got to do it now. So now it's a dog-eared, post-it note, highlighted book, and I've got a ton of questions. We had some questions coming from people as well that couldn't attend. So thank you so much for coming and joining us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to join all of you and take in whatever questions you have.
Cool. Okay. To get us started, I'm gonna steal one of my questions first. I love how you talk about culture in the book, and actually we've got Josh Levine coming on to talk about Great Mondays in a couple of months' time, because I love geeking out about anything culture. But I think so much of what you said about culture in the book touches on brand as well, and employee brand, and I know that's something we're talking about quite a lot. How do you define the two, or how do you come when it starts to projects? Like, where does brand and culture separate, and where does it come together for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that culture is probably more organic, I think, than employer brand. Or employer brand is often more of you can consciously work to craft that and shape that. Ultimately, you can't control it. So that's the thing. Actually, let me start there. You can't control either of them.
Okay.
You can influence both of them, but you're doing it in different ways. Whereas I think both ideally are intentional. Both also will formulate in their own way if you're not being intentional about them. So they're interesting. They have a lot of parallels in terms of how they are, but I think the culture tends to be more organic. It's the set of behaviors demonstrated by the leadership team and how that kind of permeates the organization. I think that's typically where cultures come from. It's your deeds, not your words. Whereas employer brand, that I think is more manufactured isn't the right word, because I think even if you don't have a dedicated employer brand focus, you still have an employer brand. But there are teams now, especially with the level of sophistication that employer brand has gotten in most organizations, who are actively trying to shape and steer that. Whereas I think, culture is done more organically, in a lot of ways more passively.
Yeah, I think that's a good definition. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
I guess other questions that we had in and I know actually, do you know what? We started talking earlier just about how you wrote the book, because I think the other thing I was thinking when I read it, it was so nice that it was a book that felt relevant, because I feel like now we've got these HR books on our bookshelves that might have been great pre-COVID, but given what we've experienced over the last 2 years, but you touched on so much of that in here. So in terms of like your writing process and how you made it come together so quickly, how did you go about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like the actual writing of the book was reasonably quick, and reasonably is subjective, right? But the actual the framework for the book happened over 10 plus years, right? So like I think going back to probably when I first started blogging back in 2011, I think, when I was running talent innovation at NPR. That was when I really first started writing, and I just had ideas that I wanted to get out, and then that kind of grew into writing for Forbes and Fast Company and other publications, and co-authoring the first book on employer branding, and then the podcast, Redefining HR, and kind of, so all of those things were kind of gradually building towards the book. I think as much as I appreciate the opportunity to kind of capture moments in those pieces, blog posts are typically 1,000 words. There's only so deep you can go. And I wanted to really create something that was a holistic view of all of the things. And I say all of the things with an asterisk, because no book can capture all the things, especially with a field as complex as HR. But I wanted to really kind of put together everything that I had learned, all the interviews I had done, all the conversations I had had, all the conferences I presented at, and package them in a way that kind of laid a blueprint for what modern HR can look like. And it was also really important to me in writing it that, it wasn't, there's a lot of books that are, analysts' takes or, pundits' takes on what you should be doing as a practitioner. And like, I didn't want to write that book because I'm not a practitioner, right now. Like, I haven't been in a corporate role in 8 years. So I wanted to own that. And that was why it was really important for me to make sure that I brought in lots of case studies into the book and into each chapter so that I could illuminate what companies are doing in that space. So it wasn't just me saying, hey, you should probably do X. Like, yeah, there's a bit of that, but there's also saying, let me kind of share now 3 examples of companies that are doing X and like how they're doing it and what they're learning to make it more practical and tangible for readers. So that piece is really, I didn't want to write another business book or another kind of theoretical HR book. It was really important to me to write a practical book that was relatable to people in the roles doing the work. And I think the timing of it, obviously, starting the book a few months into, I had a framework and outline. I signed the book deal before COVID, but I didn't really get to start writing it in earnest until a few months into COVID. And that delay was actually really helpful because I was able to account for all the things that are our reality now, right? Like the shift towards remote and hybrid work, the different conversations we're having around mental health, the different conversations we're having around racial equity and social justice. Those kinds of things that the narratives and the way that we think about those today are very different than they were even 3 years ago. And so, in some sense, I guess that timing was fortuitous that the book ended up, being published in January of 2021. So it was one of the first books written kind of for this new world of work that we're actually still in the early stages of building right now.
Yeah, I definitely have some questions on that later. Guys, I'm going to keep asking questions. If anyone has any, please put your hand up or just drop them in the box. If not, it's just going to be me quizzing Lars, which is fine. But on what you've just said, and it actually leads into another question. Like, I love that it's really practical, and I think there's so many books, marketing and HR, that's so much about theory, and in reality, we all know the reality is fairly different to theory sometimes. So I love that side of it. I think the one thing is that they're often quite large companies. And I think there's also the bit about scale up. How do you think that you can take those, or let me rephrase that. How, if I'm working in a smaller business, can I look at those large company examples and like take the bits and pieces and know what I can relate to? Because I think sometimes there's that, going back to employee brand, a great example, right? Whether you're a 1-person HR team or whether you're a 50-person HR team, you've still got an employer brand. You're just handling it differently.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it was important to me in the book to have a range of company sizes in the examples, because I think that there's something to be learned from everywhere. Now, like if you're looking at a Siemens that has a 5-person future of work team that's doing nothing but future of work assessments and analysis and kind of future casting, yeah, like if you're an HR team of 1, that's not accessible to you. But there are elements maybe of what they're doing that you can draw inspiration from. And so I think one of the things that I kind of called out in the book is I don't use the term best practices. I think it's too subjective, right? Like, well, the reason a practice works in your organization is dependent on so many variables that are unique to your organization. So to assume that another company can just replicate that and turnkey into their organization is a fallacy. What I do think, though, is that you can find inspiration of what those other companies are doing. You're not going to replicate that thing because you don't have all of the ingredients that make that thing work, but you can replicate elements of it and localize them to your environment. And so, for me, that was one of the reasons I've always been such a big proponent of open source. It wasn't that you're going to copy somebody's playbook on how they do X, but like big companies can draw inspiration from small companies, and small companies can draw inspiration from big companies. And I think we, in the past, we tended to think kind of level wise, like, well, only companies of that size can do X, or only companies that are that small or nimble enough to do Y. When I think both can actually be false. Like you can actually borrow elements from different size organizations. You may not have the same resources, but you might be able to hack your way to something similar. And so that's why it was really important to kind of include that range of company sizes and even industry, even though the probably lean tech a bit. I wanted to have some breadth in industry as well, because I think that too oftentimes we're kind of in a bubble of like industries, like companies, like-minded people who are approaching things the same way. I think it helps to pierce that and kind of see what people are doing who you wouldn't ordinarily exchange ideas with, but there could actually be some rich learning there.
Totally. Having the same conversation just around like mentorship the other day. And actually, sometimes the best thing you can do is get a mentor from a totally different industry and from a different size business because you're going to look at it so differently. It's the only way you're going to get out of your headspace and stop this like tunnel vision on a certain project. And, it kind of, but you've got to get away from like wanting the answers almost, or like you say, or wanting this best practice and just being like, I just want to hear 62 different ways of doing something. I'll borrow a little bit from everything and work out what works for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing I was going to ask is, well, what's not in the book? Like, so when you got to editing, you obviously had to take some stuff out. Was there anything that you really wanted to include that just didn't make the cut?
It's funny. No. And I don't mean to say like the book had everything in it. Of course it didn't have everything, but like all of the things that were really important to me to include in the book,
Mhm.
I was able to get in. I mean, I had some battles with my publisher around language in some cases. They're
Okay.
British conservative business publishing firm, and I use colorful language at times that doesn't always apply to global business audience. So we had some of those battles, but for the most part, there was nothing that they took out. And there were some things, frankly, that I fought to keep in. I think particularly the chapter on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I felt we collectively, we HR, needed to hear some hard truths on our history as it relates to DEIB. And so it was important for me to kind of to include that in that chapter and to hold us accountable a bit for our past, but also to pave a way towards the future that we can have if we work to have it. And so, that was an area where there's a couple sections in there that they wanted to, remove or water down, and I fought for it. I said I'm not going to do that because this is the way that I want to that I think people need to hear it, and the way that is important for me to frame it.
That's awesome. I guess as well, so leading on to that, obviously this was January 2021, can't even say it now. A whole year's passed and the last year's been crazy, and given what we're going through now, it just seems to be getting wilder by the minute. Do you think there's anything that needs different focus now compared to when you published, and things that kind of need a little bit more, or like bringing to the forefront, or I guess like HR people need to really think about their skills development in a certain area because of what's changing and the amount of change we've been through in that 2 years?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I think crisis management, frankly, is an area that I touched on in the book a little bit. But if I was writing it today, I'd certainly go a lot deeper. I mean, I wrote the book before we had our January 6th insurrection in the United States, and before, obviously, Russia's war on Ukraine, and so many things that have happened. So I think that the role of a CPO is already one of, if not the hardest job in the C-suite. It's only gotten harder because now we're dealing with just crisis after crisis after crisis that we're having to support all of our employees through, while also experiencing them as an individual. And I think that's part of the reason why burnout levels are so high in HR. You're seeing a lot of seasoned HR leaders take a break from the
Mm.
field or leave the field altogether because they're just burned out. So I think that was beginning to be the case. I think when I was writing the book, it's certainly been elevated since. And I think that, there's no reason to think that the times that we're in are going to be less volatile over the coming year and years. And so I think that kind of crisis comms component, is becoming a more essential skill set, especially for HR leaders.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. On the burnout piece, because I think you're right. I don't know. I'm sure it's the same in the US as it is over here in Australia. Like the number of chief people officer roles, talent acquisition roles, there's a huge number of vacancies and just not enough people. And I think some of that is just what's happening with tech, but also people opting out is exactly what you've said. Like everyone's had a tough couple of years, but no one as tough as people in HR. Do you think there's anything we could be doing better as a community to rally around that, to stop people opting out and to maybe fight burnout a little bit better than we have been?
Yes. Do I have those answers?
No.
No. I mean, I think that it's hard. Like, the role of an HR, especially HR officers, is deeply personal. Right? You are oftentimes not to be dramatic, but like kind of the soul of the organization. Or if you're doing it right, you carry and you see all of the scars and the hardship and the emotional baggage and the bad behaviors and all of those things that happen in your organization. And I think particularly the last couple of years, as we've been through crisis after crisis after crisis, you are on the front lines of every one of those, helping, coach and lead your executive peers and your CEO through that turmoil. leading your people team through that turmoil, leading the organization and your employees through that turmoil, while also experiencing that turmoil yourself. And you hear a lot of analogies around, you should put your own oxygen mask on first. And we suck at that. We're tending to everybody else first. We tend to come last. And I think that just, to some extent, that comes with the role and the type of the personalities that typically go after these kind of roles. But it opens us up to a lot of emotional hardship and burden. And so, I ask chief people officers in my podcast all the time, like, how do you protect yourself from burnout? And the ones that seem to be effective at it, they're pretty good at creating boundaries for themselves and really defending those boundaries. And frankly, that's the only thing that I've heard consistently that has helped people leaders, help to kind of push off some of this burnout that they're facing. So like, whether it's, in my calendar, when it's blocked out of these times, it's blocked out, period. That includes the CEO. Like, if there's an absolute emergency, yes, like obviously I'm available. But if it's just like, hey, I want your opinion on here, like, no, not during these times. If it's taking Slack off your phone on the evenings and the weekends, not having work email on your personal phone, there's different ways that you can try to do that. But I think that that's the only method that I've seen that has had success, frankly.
Yeah, we talked a lot about boundary setting with Laurie last month about that, and it is that theme that keeps coming up. But I personally suck at boundary setting, and I know a lot of people do.
Yeah, I mean, I do too. Like, it's easy to say that that's important. Like, there's nobody who's going to be like, oh no, that's not important. Like, we all know it's important. It's about what you actually do. And so
Yeah,
it takes discipline, it takes repetition. I don't have the answers because I also suck at it myself. So,
yeah,
yeah, I think it's something that you just have to be committed to working on, and also like be kind with yourself. Like, you're not always going to be like 100% firm to those barriers. You do your best. And as you repeat doing your best, hopefully you get better and better and better at it. And it's a skill that is acquired, especially in this environment that many of us have come up in, that is like always on. And, again, I think at a macro level, we're kind of moving from this hustle grind culture to this new thing that we're building. And we don't really know what this new thing that we're building is yet,
yeah.
but it is not glorifying the grind. And so, that's a process, right? Like, that's not an overnight pendulum swift. It's going to take a little bit of time to get there. But yeah, I'm excited to see that take more shape and more people really prioritize self-care and their own well-being.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's that difficult piece in the middle, right? The messy middle of, we know it's changing, we're just not entirely sure what it's going to look like. And we've been through change so quickly. Like,
Yeah.
Work from home is a great example. I remember, 3 years ago, I would work for a business that if you weren't at your desk at 8:30 a.m., you weren't seen to be working. And the same if you didn't finish till 5, right? And it was so strict, like everyone had to be there. And then to go fully remote, and now no one wants to go back to an office, just the culture shift and the behavior shift and everything else that comes along with it. It's an intense amount of change in a short space of time.
Yeah, it's significant. And again, I think the interesting part is like, we don't know how this is. We're building this now, right? We're building something that hasn't existed before in terms of like the broadly speaking, this new world of work. And so how it comes together, how it's developed, I don't know. But I think that there's going to be a lot of opportunity to do things in a more kind of thoughtful, compassionate and supportive way. Because I think a lot of people, going through what we've experienced as, mankind over the last 2 years, it's caused a lot of people to rethink their priorities and what's important to them. And there are very few people coming out of this saying, "Oh, I wasn't prioritizing work enough. I need to put more emphasis on work. I was too slack in my job." Like, nobody's there, right?
Yeah.
So going the other way, and so companies have to adapt to that.
Yeah, it's so true. Yeah, no one's like, I needed to go to the office for more hours each week. Oh, that's the thing I was doing wrong.
Right. I have so much regret about all those hours I didn't work.
Right. Back to a few questions from the book that we had in. Employee experience, going back to what we were saying just about talent shortages. I spoke to a few people, I was talking about it in a session yesterday as well. Just like in candidate and employee experience still seems to suck a little bit. right? Like particularly we keep saying we've got these talent shortages, we can't get enough people, and then we're like, hey, can you do 5 interviews, and we're not going to get back to you in between, and we're probably not going to give you any feedback, and then we're just going to send you a standard rejection email at the end of it. Do you think, or have you got any examples of anyone that's doing a great job with either candidate or employee experience that we could kind of look at as a little bit of inspiration for like, yeah, that's the benchmark?
Yeah, I mean, I think not really a specific company comes to mind, but I think in terms of practices, really like we've been talking about candidate experience for a decade now, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, this is not new. I think that we still struggle with actually adapting. And I think the challenges right now is there's still a lot of companies and a lot of hiring managers who are hiring like it's 2020 and they're interviewing like it's 2020 and like it's not.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to really think very differently about onboarding, about pre-boarding, right? The time before they've even started, from when they've accepted the offer, when they actually show up. You've got to think very differently about that, and especially in these new, distributed and remote environments. You don't treat me well as a new employee. You're not thoughtful. You're not proactive. I close my laptop one day and I open it the next day and I'm working for another company, right? I mean, that's like there's no friction in changing jobs right now. And the hires that we have are people that we've only and oftentimes met via, Zoom. So that the stickiness of hires when you've had somebody in your office and you've shared a meal or shared coffee and talked about like that's not here in many cases right now. And so if you're not doubling down on pre-boarding and onboarding and being overly proactive, frankly borderline annoyingly proactive, you have a real risk of hiring short-term talent that is now going to go back in their peer communities and say like, this is a shitty place, they didn't treat me well. And so yeah, I think that this moment, hiring in this environment, has just really underscored the importance of candidate experience, and I think a lot of companies are missing that mark.
Totally. It was a friend who actually works in employer branding, that was looking for new jobs, and she was just saying, she's like, I'd love to write some sort of anonymous diary about the actual experiences that like you get told versus actually what you're going through. Because with,
Yeah.
like you say, we've been talking about candidate experience, employee brand, everything for so long, and we're still kind of some of these fundamentals. So I recently accepted a new job, and I could start really quickly because I'd just finished a contract role, about to start a new one. And they phoned me, somebody different phoned me every day for a week to check in. Did I need anything? Did I have any questions? Introduce themselves. I was like, this is weird. Usually
Yeah.
you get ignored, right? Like I'm
Yeah.
so used to just being like, you sign the contract, you start in 4 weeks, you turn up at the office. So it's the first time I've kind of started somewhere remotely. And I genuinely was just like so strange. I was like, are they a bit desperate? Is this normal? And then afterwards I was like, oh, I shouldn't have thought that was weird, that they just wanted to know I was okay and I felt comfortable starting. Like
Yeah,
that
I
shouldn't be
mean,
the abnormal experience, right? That should be
no,
the
it
normal
shouldn't, but it
experience.
is. Well, congrats on the new job.
Thanks.
But I think it's we don't expect it. We expect the opposite. So like, yeah, when people are paying attention and doing it right, it does feel a little bit weird because it's not something that we're accustomed to.
Yeah.
So yeah, I definitely get that.
I guess on that, so we've been talking about candidate experience for years, as you said, the same employer. Do you think, and like it's kind of like we just haven't shifted quickly enough, particularly with the interviews is a great example, the interview process. Do you think there's a way we could start shifting quicker and be like, hey, this has changed, we just need to do something about it? Do you think there's a reason that it's not moving and we're not keeping up?
Um, yeah, change is hard, right? And I
Yeah.
think that hiring teams are often, especially more seasoned hiring managers, like they've interviewed for a long time. They've been hiring for a long time. They have a certain set of expectations and protocol of how they think things should go. Um, you can easily make those adjustments, right? Like it's not rocket science to say like we don't need 5 interviews, we need 2. But the challenge is that's not solely a recruiter's decision, right? They can influence, and hopefully they're in a position where they're a trusted advisor to their team, and they can say, you know what, we're losing candidates, and here's some data around like attrition at the different stages of the recruiting funnel, based on our process and our timeline. So like, hopefully our tech has gotten a lot better. We should have much more data to reinforce, like not just saying, hey, this is a bottleneck, but actually say like, look at the numbers, like numbers don't lie, this is clear. But ultimately kind of comes down to having those relationships to be able to steer that differently. And it's more than just the recruiter, it's the hiring teams it's the department leads, right? The other people who are kind of stakeholders in the process, they have to be on board. So, but it's not hard. I've certainly seen it. I mean, look, even Google pivoted. Like Google used to have a
Mm.
ridiculous interview process. They'd have like 8, 9, 10 interviews, and they realized that that doesn't work, and they had to trim that down. And so I think it certainly can be done. There has to be will and there has to be leadership to kind of influence that direction. But yeah, it can and should be done, frankly, especially in this environment.
Yeah, I think I started seeing more companies put their interview processes online with their application forms, which I think is a great start. So at least people
Yeah,
know what to expect. And I think when Google started to cut down a number of interviews, a few startups followed suit as well. It was like, oh, maybe we don't need 7 interviews, 2 tests, 3 personality tests, and whatever else. Like we can
right.
just work out whether this person's good or not. But yeah, I think we've got a long way to go.
And I mean, I would say too,
Um,
like we tend to overcomplicate candidate experience sometimes.
mhm.
Like I remember, and kind of talking about the, giving visibility in the interview process. I remember 2012, I think I was back when I was at NPR running talent acquisition and innovation for them. Very basic. We created, we knew the FAQs that candidates typically had when they applied for a job, right? Like, what is the process like? When will I hear back? What are the next steps in the process? What's the timeline? All those kinds of things. Like, we knew those are the questions the candidates had. We created an FAQ, with all those questions that we knew people had, and we embedded that as an auto response on the application. So, like, literally as soon as you apply, this is not high tech, this is as low tech as you get. It's an auto response, right? You apply and you automatically get an email back, hey, thanks for your interest in the role, we're excited to review your resume, just to let you know, here's kind of what to expect in the process, and things like that. And that lifted our candidate experience so much by that one simple act. And there's nobody who's watching this right now who can't do that, right? Like, that's just such a basic and easy thing that I don't understand why every company doesn't do, because it's such a low lift, high impact thing. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a very easy thing that we don't always have to. It's not always about having these AI driven tools and auto prompted surveys and things like that. Like, yes, like we should get more sophisticated in our efforts, but even if you're low tech, like you can do that. Even if you don't have an ATS, if people are literally sending you an email with their resume, you can do that. So sometimes high impact things can be in low tech areas.
Yeah, I think that's a really good shout out. Like, stop overcomplicating it. What's the quick and simple stuff we can do that would make a difference? That's so true. I guess on the tech side of things, and the HR tech landscape in the last few years has been completely wild, and I think will continue to do so. Given all the challenges that HR are facing, is there any tech that you're super excited about, kind of see evolve over the next couple of years?
I mean, there's lots of tech that I'm excited about. There's way more tech that I can even get my head around, right? Because I think
Yeah.
there's, record levels of venture capital being poured into VC. $4 billion was poured into VC in a single quarter last year alone, which is more than the previous year altogether. So the amount of money being poured into space, especially when you look at like everything driven by the pandemic and this new world of work we're building, so much of it is tech enabled, right? Or needs to be tech enabled. And so you're seeing whole new categories of HR technology come into the marketplace right now. So, tools that I get excited about, automation tools, smart automation. I think that we don't need to do everything manually. We've often have been put in that position where we've had to do things manually, and then when that's the case, things get dropped off. They get dropped. Like, it's if we're human, we make mistakes. There are aspects of our role that absolutely we can and should automate, and so that's a technology that I'm bullish on. Um, you know, AI is more of a buzzword than a technology. I think in a lot of cases, like everybody's saying that they have AI. I think the use of AI as it relates to recruiting and helping make connections between opportunities and candidates that humans tend to miss when we're just looking at resumes and job descriptions. That I'm really excited about. I think we're a few years off for that being broadly adopted. The challenge in that tech is, you need to have a pretty sizable data set to model on. And so that's why I think you tend to see these companies or these tools in enterprise companies, because they've got a much larger data set to model the AI on to kind of do matching with prospects. But I think as we get better with that, that technology and the price point will go down. I think we'll start to see more of that matching technology. I mean, recruiting in general, the way we recruit today is really not much different than how we recruited 20 years ago. We're just doing it online as opposed to faxing, job applications. So I think that that market is ripe for disruption. I also think internal talent management is going to be a category that we're going to see a lot from as it relates to companies finding ways to kind of upskill and reskill and develop their internal workforce to help them, retain their employees better. I think that's a category that we're going to see a lot more investment in the coming years.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. That internal mobility piece is going to be huge. That's awesome. We haven't had any questions for anyone else, and they're all the questions I've had from the audience. So I'm going to probably ask you one more and then let you go. Are you planning any more books? What's next?
Probably, but not soon. I mean, so after I wrote the book, I got a lot of feedback from people who read the book who were, wanting to kind of go deeper in modern HR practices and were asking me kind of where can they go to continue their education, and I didn't really have anywhere to send them. And so that made me realize quickly that, that's something that I need to build. And so, last year I created a new Amplify Accelerator within kind of my company, which is a couple different things. It's a cohort programming, but kind of developing and connecting and supporting the next generation of chief people officers. It's a community. There's a job board, and they're on-demand courses. And so, while I won't be working on another book soon, part of that reason is now I'm focused on building a series of on-demand courses aimed at supporting, HR leaders who I think there's elements of that role that we just get no training in whatsoever, whether it's, business acumen, executive presence, interacting with a board, IPO readiness, things like that that are just, they're not in any of our curriculum for those of us that were even trained in HR. And so I want to build more courses like that to better support the community and kind of, help them build some of the skills they need to be successful in that role. So from a content perspective, this year I think I'll be focused on building, probably 4 or 5 courses in the accelerator, and then we'll see. Maybe next year I'll start popping my head up and having ideas I want to get down from the next book.
Yeah, there might be some book ideas that come out of all those courses, but I think that's super exciting. I look forward to seeing it. Thank you so much for today. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on, and really enjoy the chat.
Cool. I'll speak to you soon. Thanks.
All right, take care.